So today on the podcast, we'll continue our story of Disney legend Mary Blair. Last month, we followed Mary as she began work on her 3 big Disney features, specifically on Cinderella and Alice in Wonderland, films in which her design work picked up elements of her personal life, specifically her recent move to New York and her desire to start a family. Today we'll explore Mary's life as she worked on the 3rd film in that set, Peter Pan, a story ideally suited for her, as it presented an island of endless childhood, with childhood being one of the key themes in her post-California scene movement paintings. But before we jump back down into the world of the early 1950s, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. There are research and production costs tied to each one of our episodes. For example, the material in today's story about Mary Blair comes from interviews, special collection units, and archives spread across the country. And our Bandcamp subscribers are the people who make all of this possible. I'm grateful to each and every person on Bandcamp who helps this podcast move forward. But today, a special note of thanks is going out to Downtown Fred, Alexander, SL South WI, Rascal, and Rocketeer 8+2. Thanks to each of you and to all of our Bandcamp subscribers for supporting all we do here. And now, here's the show. As Mary moved through pregnancy, she saw her book Baby's House published. The text and concept had been created by writer Jalolo McHugh, but the illustrations, which comprised most of the book, had been produced by Mary. The New York Times reviewed the title in its pages, calling parents and librarians' attention to a visual story that will catch the young child's satisfaction in everyday objects as Baby marches through his house, making a joyful inventory of those things which are important in the first years of life. The critical success of Baby's House prompted Mary to take on another illustration assignment from the same publisher, this time to provide images for a text written by Ruth Krauss, a picture book called I Can Fly, in which a young girl, again presented as a stylized Mary Blair child, mimics the actions of animals around her. Standing on a playground swing, the girl can fly like the birds above. In a bathing suit, paddling through the water, she can swim like a fish. And stacking pillows on her back, she can pretend to be a camel with its high curved hump. This would be Mary's second foray into the world of commercial children's illustration, a medium that highlighted the strengths of her flat design. During these same months for Walt, she developed concept images for Peter Pan, a film that wouldn't be released for another 3 years. As with Alice, Pan had been in production for over a decade, since before America's entry into the war. Again, like Alice, the project had been arranged with a series of visual concepts created by David Hall. These had largely been done in 1939, during the same period that Pinocchio and Fantasia moved through production. Once again, Hall's images, largely arranged with pen, watercolors, and gouache, imagined a far darker story than in more recent Disney films. Many of his characters, through facial expressions and gesture, present themselves as mischievous and self-interested. Many scenes depict images of actual violence, underscored by a lingering human darkness central to his work. Tinkerbell, when jealous of Wendy, becomes blindly irate, her face a mask of rage, and her gestures suggesting that she is capable of any crime. Likewise, when Peter first appears in the Darlings' nursery, the children appear more afraid of him than they do captured with awe at the flying boy. As with Alice, it's easy to imagine this version of Peter Pan being developed at the studio during a time when Disney features embraced elements of cinematic horror. Such sequences would include Pinocchio's existential dread as he realizes all of the ill-behaved boys on Pleasure Island are turning into donkeys, or Snow White's dark passage through the forest where every tree and twig in her imagination is another creature seeking to take her life. David Hall's vision for Pan was to be the descendant of these sequences. But during the 1940s, the Disney studio had moved away from the grotesque elements of horror and touches of naturalism, instead focusing more on family-friendly images of fantasy touched with wonder. In short, Walt wanted to put aside David Hall's 1939 concepts for Pan and instead focus on images that offered a deeper sense of play, curiosity, and whimsy, which aligned more with recent Disney pictures. This was, without a doubt, Mary's specialty. In these areas, Mary found another bond with Walt. Though Mary was interested in using art to explore the worldview of children, or at least of idealized children, Walt over the previous 3 years had been drawn back to the wonders of childhood, re-experiencing them for himself. 3 years earlier, Walt had set up a tabletop Lionel train in his studio office, which he enjoyed during downtime. The following year, along with studio machinists, he built a scale model engine and a set of cars that he used at the studio, a garden-style railroad large enough for people to ride seated on top of various boxcars and gondolas. Now Walt was designing a backyard layout for his garden railroad. In this, Mary was engaging a similar impulse to the one that now drove Walt. Mary, too, was drawn back into the wonders of childhood, though she explored this impulse through watercolors and pastels arranged for children's books, while Walt explored it through equipment he built at the studio and at home. As Mary transitioned into Peter Pan, Walt arranged for her and Lee to see a stage version of the story as it opened on Broadway, late in April 1950. She and Lee drove into Manhattan to see it at the St. James Theater, which was just a few blocks away from the Mayfair Theater where, less than 2 months earlier, Disney's Cinderella had premiered in the city. In this, Mary had the unusual experience of researching material for a new Disney project right down the way from where one of her previous Disney projects had recently opened. Despite the surreal aspects of this experience, she settled into her seats to watch the new stage presentation of Pan, focused on how the offering might help move her beyond the work of David Hall. The stage version starred Jean Arthur as Peter Pan and Boris Karloff, famous for playing Frankenstein, in the dual role of Captain Hook and Mr. Darling. Mary was impressed by the dancing and the songs, viewing the production as an effective flight of fantasy into the world of children. In particular, Mary focused on the childlike visual appeal of the characters. Nana, the dog nurse, was big and lovable, she explained. Even the crocodile was lovable. These impressions no doubt influenced how she began to shape the material for Disney, a stage play where even the menacing croc had a noticeable charm. In a letter thanking Walt for the tickets, she added, "The stage show was good, but the Disney version can be better." By this point, Mary was nearly 5 months pregnant with her second child, a child that she hoped would be a girl, evening up the number of girls and boys in her family. Her enthusiasm to have a daughter was evident in the images she then created for I Can Fly. In Baby's House, the young boy was connected with the wondrous toys around him, whereas in I Can Fly, the young girl was connected to the animals that lived with her on a farm and found connections to more exotic animals like a camel through images and books. Thoughts of a second child likely influenced how she brushed out the world of Pan, the darling children, and other residents of Neverland. If Cinderella had deeply connected with the sense of isolation she felt in New York, Pan connected with the center of her current artistic outlook. After pivoting away from the California scene movement, Mary had focused her watercolors and gouache on the presentation of an idealized childhood, specifically how the outlook of young children was categorically different than that of adults. This was evident during the 1941 South American trip with watercolors of children in Peru, later on the 1942 trip to Mexico with paintings depicting children engaging the Las Posadas tradition, then with the presentation of children in Song of the South and So Dear to My Heart. Beyond Disney, she had explored the world of young children in Baby's House and also with her current work on I Can Fly. Now she was given an entire film, largely set on an island where children never grew up, a perpetual world focused on the meaning and joys of childhood. Under her brush, the trepidation of children evident in Hall's paintings was replaced with active curiosity. The open conflict with Hook was exchanged with a playful and witty battle. Moreover, the magical island held a sense of endless wonder, underscored only by a distant sense of danger. From this perspective, Mary's work on Pan was a cinematic culmination of her own vision, at least as it had been engaged for the past 9 years, into a unified cinematic concept for a Disney feature. As Mary's packets of paintings showed up at the Disney studio, other artists observed that these designs were far closer to contemporary Disney fare than the work that David Hall had completed in the late 1930s. Walt Paragoy, an artist who later in-betweened on Peter Pan, explained that Mary's work was styled. It was pastel, whimsical, charming. It was beautifully designed. It was believable. Animator Mark Davis saw Mary reaching for a type of expression that exceeded commercial art, distilling how a child's outlook defined her vision for Peter Pan. I don't think even Matisse could hold a candle to her, Davis said, and I mean that very sincerely. She could put colors together and they would just sing. Her work was generally quite stylized. Whereas David Hall's illustration for Pan had proposed a thematic mood underpinned by conflict, coupled with an unsettling fear of the unknown, Mary's work emphasized whimsy, a child's sense of acceptance, and abiding curiosity about what lay beyond the familiar world. Mary didn't invent the dramatic story elements of Pan. Its author, J.M. Barrie, had done that decades ago. Rather, through her paintings, she adjusted Peter Pan's overall meaning, transforming the material into something that better fit a Disney production. Once again, most lead artists rallied around Mary's work, seeing it as a map that would improve the Pan project. But there were a few who were quietly irked that Mary was given personal space to explore narrative materials while they were tied to house style. These few resented privileges and opportunities offered to Mary but denied others. And for some beneath that they held a deeper resentment, specifically how much Walt liked both Mary and her work, believing that her contributions better solidified his vision than did work completed by other prominent artists at the studio. Mark Davis explained that Mary was now becoming one of the forces behind Walt and the studio itself. She personally, and very few people ever did this, affected Walt and his judgment and his taste. She brought an awareness that there was some other kind of art than things that just looked like things. This, in a nutshell, was exactly what simmered beneath that small pocket of resentment at the studio. That Mary, without trying, had done what others could not. She had changed how Walt understood art, convincing him that elements of modern and contemporary art could affect the emotional tone of a film more effectively, or at least differently, than the type of European illustration that Walt had been drawn to in the 1930s with Snow White and Pinocchio. At times, Mary was aware, if only slightly, of these factions at the studio, factions that in her view weren't so much about professional jealousies as personal ownership of a vision. Like most artists at Disney, Mary, too, remembered how important it had been in art school to create an individual vision that announced your abiding themes. The studio, as a commercial enterprise, was focused on artistic work developed by a group. Many will say that this type of collaborative style is bad, Mary later explained, but I feel that is one of its very virtues. The Egyptians created a style, and it would be very hard to credit any one Egyptian artist with the temples and pyramids. I contributed key color sketches and character designs and did not work on the actual artwork as seen on the screen, as that was accomplished by the animators, background artists, and ink and paint departments. That is, Mary embraced her role in an artistic community that developed films. She didn't need to be individually acknowledged, nor did she need viewers to single out her style. She was content contributing to projects larger than anything she could have accomplished on her own. But she also understood that many artists around her, including Lee, still craved the status that came from individual recognition. For them, it wasn't enough to work on a project that was enjoyed by millions. They wanted public acknowledgement of their vision and abilities, to believe that their gifts were somehow larger than those of artists around them. But in the summer of 1950, Mary couldn't be bothered with such workplace pettiness. She had a large group of supporters at Disney, from Ward Kimball to Retta Scott. Even the studio nurse, Hazel George, was quickly becoming a close friend. Moreover, she was focused on the birth of her second child, an event that again would transform her life. Though Mary had wanted a daughter, a wish she had told many people, including Walt, she gave birth to a son who she immediately adored. She named him Kevin, her second and final child. He was born on August 15, 1950. One of the first to welcome Kevin into the world was Walt Disney. Mary, as usual, quickly wrote back, "Did I say something about wanting a daughter?" she said. "But now I'm so busting at the seams with pride over two sons. It's hard to imagine. Two possible animators, two prospective firemen for your backyard railroad, two possible wild Indians." Now that they were a family of four, the Blairs moved into a new house on Summer Avenue in Great Neck. Though the house wasn't near a lake, it was surrounded by pine trees and just down the road from the country club. The house was larger than their first home in New York, better suited for a couple with two young children. Still, Lee was hopeful that he could soon afford a house near a body of water, a place that might remind him of the indoor-outdoor lifestyle of California, as he wanted to spend some time sailing and swimming, especially in the summer. But such a house would require Lee's business to produce higher levels of profit. Back in the 1940s, Lee's business, Film Graphics, had produced multiple projects for General Electric as well as other companies. One key customer was the International Nickel Company, for which Lee made multiple documentaries on how to mine nickel, how to mill and smelt nickel ore, as well as public relations offerings that presented the nickel industry in a positive light. The films were typically a combination of live action and animation, Lee explained. For example, live action showing actual nickel mines in Canada, and then animation to show how nickel was removed from the earth. By the summer of 1950, his work was focused more on TV projects. TV began to grow, Lee explained, and we started to do TV spots. Lee's studio produced commercials for Campbell's Soup and Maxwell House Coffee. It also worked directly with network productions. In the coming year, for example, Lee's company, now mostly called TV Graphics, would create the animated closing credits for I Love Lucy. In these opportunities, Lee saw potential for greater financial success, but one that came at a cost. As his business expanded, he only had time to paint on Sunday, typically watercolors that used the California scene aesthetic to capture regional life in New York. I have one of the Fulton Street Fish Market in the Bronx with the tug going along the back, Lee said. Kids riding bicycles down in the foreground, reflected in mud puddles, and so forth. At this point in his life, though, he no longer had time to market his work. I never established a relationship with a commercial gallery in New York, he said. I suppose I should have, but I had other things on my mind. The one exception to Lee's growing work-centered lifestyle were vacations. In the summers, the family spent time in Cape Cod. Once there, Lee and Mary fell back into their own lives, the ones they had enjoyed at art school. Oh, we painted a lot together at the Cape, Lee explained. One summer he brushed out an image of Mary near the Atlantic, similar in style to a painting he had made years earlier by the Pacific, a thematic follow-up of sorts. In this, it was easy to see that Lee's approach to painting had changed little over the past 10 years. What else was clear but rarely acknowledged by Lee was that Mary's style had radically changed since art school, but his own style was still tied to a movement now 2 decades old, even if his technique had improved. Now that he was a business owner and manager, he found little time to work with this. After a few weeks at the Cape, the Blairs returned to New York where various responsibilities awaited him. Following the birth of Kevin, Walt pared back Mary's assignments, likely to give her time to be a mother. Her assignments now were more focused on short subjects, creating both concept art and defining a cartoon's color palette. Though at least one of the shorts, Rugged Bear, was a traditional Disney cartoon with Donald Duck and Humphrey the Bear. 2 others picked up on Mary's increasing interest in children's picture books. Almost surely Walt saw this as an opportunity to expand the tonal range of pictures the studio produced, with a new style of shorts that did not include well-known Disney characters. These shorts would look and feel like a children's picture book read aloud with images that moved. The first project, Susie the Little Blue Coupe, was not based on a published children's book, but was developed and written by Disney artist Bill Peet, who almost surely tried to publish it along with his illustrations. A few years later, Bill Peet would become a celebrated children's author, but at this point he was experimenting with different concepts. A draft still exists of the Susie manuscript that shows the 40-page layout complete with passages of text and ink drawings. But the project never found its way into print. Instead, Walt asked Peet to develop his story for the screen. Peet, along with fellow story artist Don DeGrati, lightly adapted his material, removing some scenes, combining and shortening others, and deleting about half of the narration, largely to fit the narrative into an 8-minute short. The end result was a set of story illustrations set in a world in which cars have personalities and desires, as well as eyes situated into their windshields. It told the story of Susie, a car purchased by a man in the 1940s who loved her, but years later, as she broke down, he sold her to buy a new vehicle. From there, Susie was owned by a man with a drinking problem and later was stolen, until finally a teenaged boy refurbished her with love into a hopped-up speedster. When Mary received the material from Bill Peet, she redid his illustrations, rounding out the appearance of the cars and making them more visually appealing. She also created a color scheme for the cartoon, arranging hues in a way that was significantly beyond Peet's ability. Lastly, she created an overall design that would make a short feel like a picture book. But beyond this, she must have related to the story's theme, a hopeful individual who transformed herself as the 1950s emerged, as this was exactly what Mary was beginning to do with her own publishing career, looking to the offerings in New York to create a new professional and personal identity for herself. The other cartoon was based on a published children's book, The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton. Like Susie the car, the little house was an anthropomorphized structure with her 2 front windows becoming eyes and her doorknob a nose. Again, Mary's work created characters and a color scheme far more appealing than those in the original book. Also, again, the story touched on Mary's own experience. The narrative follows a house who loved her original location on a hill until a city moved in around her, a city that deeply resembled New York, and the house felt separated from the people and experiences she once loved. The story ends when the house is moved, fixed up, and again owned by a young family. This, too, is another version of Mary's current life. How she was finding new ways to remake herself as the world she once loved, that of art school and California studios, partially fell away and she found herself in New York, where the center of cultural and artistic production was different than that of Los Angeles. In the summer of 1951, she saw Alice in Wonderland appear in theaters around her. Though Cinderella had been a tremendous success for the studio, Alice struggled financially at the box office, also with reviews. The New York Times said, "A few of the episodes in the film are dandy, such as the Mad Tea Party and the Caucus Race," but the reviewer also added that the story unfolded with a slow, uneven pace. Other reviewers noted that Alice lacked warm, likable characters central to previous Disney efforts. Still, one of the central appeals of the film was the visual environment that Mary largely helped invent. From beginning to end, one reviewer added, the decorative color patterns and the adventurous whimsy of the drawings are a delight. The film ultimately wasn't about character growth or an intricate plot, rather immersion into a world of inventive play and compelling designs, which were the hallmarks of Mary's work. As Mary found success on the screen with movies distributed around the world, Lee found a new importance at his company, though it was different from gallery and museum recognition that had motivated him for years. At work, he was more of a manager now, less so an artist. He wondered if, through this, he might still be completing the goal set forth for him by his family, to be like his ancestors who had important roles in politics and business. "Well, I was a big shot back here," he said. Some of this experience felt very satisfying. It was a type of success, only not the exact type he wanted. Still, his company was now giving him a good income that, when combined with Mary's earnings, would hopefully be enough to buy or build yet another house in a year or two, a house by a pond or a lake. With their continued success, the Blairs now had enough money to help Mary's parents in their old age. Mary and Lee were good to them, a family member explained, paying for trips to New York and staying for several months at a time. These trips included visits at Christmas, which, at least for Mary, remained one of her favorite times of the year. She strung popcorn, set up a large tree, and played Christmas albums. She made their house into a wonderland, both for herself and for her kids. On Christmas Eve, the Blairs attended services at the Episcopalian Church, All Saints, not far from their house. As always, Walt sent a box filled with gifts, both for the kids and for Mary. Mary was quick with her note of thanks. By 1952, she could feel her professional world beginning to expand beyond films, bristling with opportunities around her, not unlike narrative progress in Susie the Little Blue Coupe or The Little House. Beyond work, Mary felt the demands of motherhood in a new way, now that she had 2 young children, one in kindergarten and one who was now a toddler. The demands of motherhood were somewhat manageable, as she wasn't working on feature productions at the moment, though she knew she couldn't remain on short cartoons indefinitely. New York, she found, was different than California, with its own set of opportunities. Another wave of changes she sensed were coming, only she couldn't yet see what they were and how they might affect her life. I'll be back next week with a new episode. But before I go today, I have a small announcement. W. Norton will publish my book Making Mary Poppins this coming November. It's the story of how Walt's most famous live-action film was made from start to finish. For longtime listeners here, you'll recall that during the pandemic, this was about 4 years ago, we took a look at the lives of the Sherman brothers, and that was the starting point for this book. The material, of course, has been expanded, rearranged, revised since we explored the lives of the Shermans here. Like my other books, it also has a stack of endnote pages so you can see where each piece of information came from unpublished interviews up through material that Dick and Bob Sherman wrote while they were in college. The pub date for this book is November 11th, about 3 months from now. But it's up on Amazon presently as a pre-order. At the moment, it's listed with its full retail price. This book will almost surely be discounted before it's published. Amazon can adjust an item's price many times over 3 months. But if you pre-order today, you'll get the lowest price that Amazon uses on any day from now up until its publication date. So if you want to take a spin back to Cherry Tree Lane and see how this film was made moment by moment, you can find this title on Amazon or anywhere books are sold by entering either Making Mary Poppins or my name, Todd James Pierce. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.